Afternoon, and welcome to this panel on research versus higher ed cybersecurity, one world or two. So I'm Von Welch. I'm from Indiana University's Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research, where I serve as director, and it's my pleasure to moderate this. I'm going to introduce our panelists in turn, but let me just give a quick background about this panel and what it is hope we do. Between myself and the panelists, we're a mix of folks who've spent their career immersed in research, cybersecurity, and identity management versus higher ed, sort of central IT, cybersecurity, and identity management. And amongst us collectively, we've had a set of ongoing discussions over the years about how our different perspectives on cybersecurity differ, what the commonalities are, and so forth. And so we thought, let's spice this up. Let's have it in front of a room full of people, share our different views, get some feedback, and hopefully broaden and diversify this little conversation that we've been having. And our goal today is hopefully to generate some good discussion and maybe walk out of here with a better understanding if these two worlds converge in some ways or they really are different. And one sort of ground rule sort of set is, being that we're all from institutions that may have little political idiosyncrasies, is let's try to stay out of the politics as to why these may not work together in particular things and try to sort of look at the systemic questions. I'm sure we all have good war stories. So let me start off. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give about 5 or 7 minutes, and then we'll go to general discussion. And I'm going to start with Rob Stanfield, who's the director of Purdue's Identity and Access Management Office, a unit within the Office of IT Security and Policy. His office is responsible for the oversight and integration of campus authentication and security services, and he holds a CIISSP certification and works with technology initiatives both on the main campuses and Purdue's regional. So with that, Rob?
All right. Thanks, Vaughn. I thought I'd start out a little bit, just some background on Purdue, just to kind of level set here. I'm representing the large campus, so just some stats, some numbers here to kind of help you understand what we deal with or what we're up against. We have about 15,000 staff and faculty across campus, about 60,000 grad and undergrad students. We have some 1,800 tenured or tenure-track faculty that we work with, 900 dedicated research and clinical faculty, as well as some 2,500 grad research assistants. So a lot of staff here at Purdue. We're focused on 94 core research areas. Of those are some 136 research centers and institutes across the campus that are focused on areas such as we have a Center for Assistive Technology that's looking at disabilities for folks. We have a Center for Food Safety looking to keep our food safe. We also have a discovery park that's focused on multidisciplinary research such as nanotechnology. And we've got an Office of Technology and Commercialization, a research park. I could go on. My point here is that there is quite a bit of research activity going on at Purdue. And with this amount of activity, I think that we can't be, as researchers, as security analysts and security researchers, we can't be involved in every aspect of that at Purdue. So I wanted to at least talk a little bit about kind of where I see we are and then maybe some opportunities for improvement. So we also work, my team also works a lot with the academic and business sides of the house. So we also have that sort of three-way split that we deal with. And frankly, at times, at different weeks, we get mired down in some of the day-to-day, whether that's incident response or issues of the day, or as well as projects, RFPs, and other work. So in a lot of ways, I would say that we are reactive today. Excuse me. Some areas where we collaborate today with our research teams is we've developed some standards and guidelines that cover research activities and systems. We've got an assessment matrix that we use to identify some of the risks in purchased and even some open source software packages. We've got some language that we include in our contracts for security and data privacy issues. And we've also done some work in my office with identity management. So we're doing some centralized identity authentication authorization, some work in the federations as well. So these are some areas that I think that we've had some positive impact. Also some security tools, security event management, IPS, IDS, some things like that. I think one of the other things that we're looking to add to this. We're going to try is we're seeking a risk analyst, a security risk analyst that will actually report into the security or into the research side of the house, but we'll have a dotted report back to our CISO. I think the hope is that that person will help us to move some of that security policy guidelines, some of that work down into those areas for us and with us. So what are some opportunities that I see to sort of unify this cybersecurity program? I think our security teams need to transition to being more of enablers. It's not that we always say no, sometimes we say no, but I think we need to move to a place where we're helping to define the strategy. So this is an area I'd like to see us work in. Researchers are experts in their field. Security folks are experts in those fields. So I think if we can, somehow collaborate and come up with some of these future needs, identify those, I think we can help each other. And I'll get to kind of our approach, I guess, on what we're trying to accomplish here at Purdue. So I see us collaborating to help, define some better assessment matrices. Maybe take into account the types of data. We've got a lot of compliance even coming into the research side that we need to stay focused on and to help assess risk rather. So I think to some degree we want to make those decisions locally at the research unit level instead of at that IT security central level. I think there's also some opportunities for partnerships with data ownership and stewardship. I think we do a good job of managing, access and such to our student data, to our HR data. I think we need to do that same thing or more focused on the research side. But certainly identity management is another area where I think we are exploring and are doing some interesting things. I certainly think, and I heard from the previous speaker in this room, that certainly identity management is a technology that can be leveraged on the research side. I think also that central IT can help develop and provide some security intelligence and analytics, and that we can share that out to our researchers. So instead of them running those types of tools, that we can provide that intelligence back to them, not have them do it directly. So using common security tools, I think, is certainly one option there. I think for Purdue, back to my comment about having a dedicated research security staff, I think what we're taking is sort of a hybrid approach, where centrally we'll try to adopt and work out those policies and procedures that take place sort of overarching of all of IT, but let the actual implementation of that kind of be driven home and through that dotted line report to our CISO of that person. And certainly it's a priority. You have to make this a priority. It doesn't happen overnight. And for us, it's not going to happen, in the next few nights. It's going to be a process.
All right. Thank you, Rob. We move on to our second panelist now, Adam Schlegel. Adam is the Assistant Director and Chief Information Security Officer at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. In addition to daily operational security responsibilities for NCSA and the NSF-funded Exceed Federation, he's the co-PI and the NSF Bro Center, which brings its network security monitoring expertise and support to the NSF cyber infrastructure and projects. Adam?
Sure, thanks. I'm going to start out by, I guess, just painting a little bit of my background because it paints my perspective. So I feel like I have 1.5 feet sort of in the research lab, NCSA area, and half a foot of experience, thanks to Mike, in the university. And over time, my career started out where I was very much a researcher myself, doing a lot of work with students and professors, having my own rather large group of students, working with professors a lot. Now it's moved to being, I'm moved to operations more. I'm working more and more with administrators and professors anymore. And I'm working more than with one institution. I'm working with federations of institutions. And so I've seen a lot of these differences, I think, between places like NCSA that are sort of dedicated to research, labs that are smaller, and then the larger campuses. And I'm going to highlight a few of the main differences I see and how that changes how we approach security. So one of the big things that really causes many of the differences between, say, how the central IT at the University of Illinois works and how our security group works is soft money versus hard money. You wouldn't think it would have that much of an impact, but it really does. So, when it comes to resources, our human capital is pretty good. We have the central IT security team would have about 50% more people, but they are serving orders of magnitudes more projects and diverse needs. So, whereas Rob had said, they're not going to be able to get in depth. They're not going to know every researcher on campus. You're not going to be able to do an in-depth analysis for their project. You're not going to be involved in the proposal review. At least in theory, we can. I mean, there are political barriers all the time to these things, but we can actually get involved, and all the researchers, for the most part, know us and we know them. We have the same sort of retention problems that any educational institution has with security staff. We don't have the buying power, though. Because of their size, they can do things we can't. We don't have a regular hardware, security, and software budget. So, potential collaborations are things, like I talked about today with the campus CISO is, they could buy an open flow switch or this piece of hardware. They don't have the developers, they don't have the people or manpower time to do anything with it. We have that, but we can't buy anything. So there's those collaborations, and a lot of that just comes from how our funding streams are different. We depend on these huge projects. Every big infrastructure change is project driven. We moved to 100 gig networking because Blue Waters, this supercomputer, is moving to 100 gig networking. It's not something that's planned out and, ahead of time necessarily as an institution. And because of this, we're also, we're heavy on the people. We develop a lot of stuff in-house more. Things that would take people time we trade in for not having the budget to be able to go to a commercial vendor for things. Another big difference, I think, is, being in a research lab, we have a lot of agility, but very little strategy. A campus has to plan for 20 years at a time sometimes. They have to think far out. We can't. We only know there's 5 years ahead of us at any given time because that's the longest our biggest projects ever are. So, there's pros and cons to that. One of the pros is, we're fairly agile. We don't have to go through a faculty senate if we want to change a policy. We don't need committees of committees. There's 3 people I know. We need to agree on something and we can change how we do something operationally. One person can pull the plug and we can try a lot of new things and change quickly. And so this is sometimes filters down to campus where, we did this stuff with Bro, which took a lot of, manpower and digging in software development. And then we ran with that, and eventually they saw it work in NCSA and picked it up on campus. But like I said, we can't plan that far ahead, and then we really struggle with, planning hardware, software, infrastructure needs. Finally, one last thing I see that's really different when I talk versus my counterparts on campus talk about things is scale means a completely different thing to the two of us. So for campuses, scale means complexity, I think. When I hear other people on campus talk, they talk about how many departments they have. They don't, like I said, they don't know everybody there. They have to create solutions that meet the needs of this huge, diverse community. They have to worry about PCI, HIPAA, FERPA, ITAR. We generally don't worry about all those different regulations. We have a more focused mission. What does it mean at NCSA? So when we talk about scale, we mean we're thinking about exabytes of storage in the few years. We're thinking about terabit networking in a few years. But we're dealing with many fewer users of many different, and not quite as much variety. And like I said, the PIs know us and we know them. And that really makes a big difference, I think. A lot of things are the same, though. I think campuses have the wild, wild west. A lot of people are their own system administrator. It's hard to know what every department is doing. You said you had 94 core areas. Core. Yeah. And then just think about all the leaves coming off of that and branches. So we both have a lot of the wild, wild west going on in our networks. I think we have a lot of the similar threats. In the past, it might have been different, but I think those have converged. And I think we share a lot in the intelligence networks. We have the same, we're kind of tuned into the same areas for the most part.
Okay, thank you, Adam. And our third speaker is Michael Korn. Mike is the Deputy CIO and Chief Information Security Officer for Brandeis University. His areas of interest include privacy, identity management, and cloud services. He's a member of the Internet 2 Net Plus Product Advisory Board, and until recently was a member of the Box.com, Splunk Product Advisory Boards, as well as the Quality Ready Product Board. So, Mike.
Thanks, Vaughn. I'm sort of the outlier here in that I come from a campus that's about this big compared to, say, Purdue or Illinois. Brandeis is a R1. We're kind of an unusual place in that we only have just under 6,000 students, and yet we're an R1. We have a pretty good sized research portfolio, as it turns out. What makes us particularly interesting, though, is that we're about 50-50 grad students to undergraduates. So it's really an unusual place in this regard. The one thing that has really changed for me, having moved from an R1, is noticing that there is a lot less of the kind of sophisticated APT class attacks at a place like Brandeis than we had previously. But you know, now that I think about it, I'm at the first campus where Atom doesn't work at. And so I'm wondering if there's a correlation there, possibly.
I'm just less persistent there.
Less persistent there, yeah. But the truth is that historically, I always viewed the difference between the kind of work NCSA saw, or the kind of attacks NCSA saw, and what the campus experienced as a different threat agent profile. You know, I always assumed that on campus, I am not worried about state actors. I am trying to protect the general campus environment from noise coming across the internet. But I think you said it a minute ago, Adam, there seems to be a coalescing of that. And I now think that's the wrong attitude to take. I think on most campuses you have to watch for that more sophisticated attack than I previously thought you did. And I think that has to do with the changing nature of who's coming after us. You know, it used to be the Russian mob looking for money, and they're still doing that. But now you've got state actors like China that are just trying to slurp up everything they can get their hands on. And we have those nice porous borders filled with students from all over the place. At Brandeis, though, we're a very centralized place. We don't have a highly distributed IT issue. So my perspective on this has changed a lot from when I was at Big State R1, where most of the people worked outside of central IT. However, we do have some pockets of it, and we are trying to figure out how to work with them. So, for example, we have a School of Social Justice and Justice Policy. But they're about a third of our research portfolio. Now, these are social scientists. Most of what they deal with are human subjects. And yet, what they've gone and done, just to give you an example of sort of what we're faced with right now at Brandeis, is they've built their own environment. And they've done this since before I started. They started a few years ago. They have built their own walled garden for securing their really sensitive data. And they've hired their own security person, very good person, very qualified, and they're trying to do everything, which has caused them problems. Because, as you know, one person can't do everything. So we have started to work with people like that very closely to say, look, we do log consolidation. We instrument the network for monitoring on a campus scale. You've got a little building full of people. Why don't we help you by doing audits of what you're doing? We do the scanning. We feed their log data into our log environment. We do the monitoring for them. So we've worked out a different kind of partnership that works pretty well in a school our size. I think at a larger school, you really need that larger, more dedicated staff like you would have at a NCSA or Purdue, focusing on those projects. So that's worked pretty well for us at this point in time.
Good. Thank you, Mike. So we would like this to be interactive. I'll ask people to step up to the mics, and with the lights here, if I don't seem to see you, please don't be bashful. Call out. I'll start us with a question to get us rolling and give people a chance to step up. So if I summarize a little bit, on one end of the table, I'm hearing Adam saying that they have a need for agility in these research projects that makes it difficult for them to think of this centralizing. And I know one of the things that comes to my mind here is just a question of, we've had a lot of discussions recently about centralizing IT for the sake of efficiency versus keeping it decentralized for the sake of autonomy. And so how is this discussion different for cybersecurity than just any other part of IT? And is it cybersecurity as a monolithic block, or are there parts of it that maybe do lend themselves to be more centralized? Mike, I think you touched on that. So I'll just sort of throw it open to the panelists
Sure.
and let any of you jump in.
I think that the part of the challenge is when I think of, for example, this unit I described that's doing a lot of security on their own, I'm thrilled because I don't have the staff to do it. I'm glad they're doing it, and they're doing it well. At the same time, it's challenging sometimes for them to understand that I, as the institutional CISO, have an obligation to know what's going on in their world. And sometimes that's not a problem, sometimes it's a huge problem. And I really think that the answer as to whether that belongs in the center or some sort of partnership like this, unfortunately it's idiosyncratic. If the person they had hired to do security in this smaller school hated me, or was one of these people that said it's mine, go away, we would have a real conflict and friction that we'd have to figure out how to resolve. But because we're all such charming, nice, easy to get along with people, it works out extremely well.
Yeah, I don't think it's possible for us to do it all centrally. I mean, think of the staff that we would need. So I think this idea that central IT can do all of the cybersecurity is impossible. And certainly the approach Mike's talking about, where you've got some folks that are already doing this. I think from the central perspective, what I want to see is that they are that view into what they're doing, so we are aware of it, but that they are adhering to policies and procedures, data handling, all of those things that we want to see them do centrally, but can't necessarily do for them.
I think there's a lot of benefit to working with the central IT. I think agility is one of the reasons why they can't do everything we do, and we have special expertise for our kinds of systems. But I look to the central IT to set direction on policy and to make sure that we align with it. I look to them for, they provide the big behemoth buying power. If they're going to go with one solution and get a big discount for campus, and I'm looking at two choices, well, I'm going to align with campus if I can, and I get a lot of benefit out of that as well. And sometimes, like I said, we have more staff, so we can help out in developing new software or tools or things around these solutions. So there's a lot of benefit to working together. I don't think either one replaces the other.
The one thing I always thought that we should be able to do, and I don't think that I can remember it ever working particularly well, I always had this fantasy that we could reach out to a group like NCSA for incident response. And I don't ever recall really being able to make that work well.
Yeah, that's one, and I'd say that's an argument for keeping the incident response closer to the assets, is it takes intimate knowledge of those systems. For us to go in and do incident response on hire for someone, we're not familiar with their infrastructure and all their processes and their needs. And the closer that is to the resources you're protecting, I think you get some benefit there.
Yeah, exactly.
But certainly coordinate that from a central level.
It would be nice, because I know that I've had millions of those conversations with auditors and attorneys and VIPs where they want to know how breach response is handled, because that goes to things you've told insurance companies and whatnot. So even though there's two separate worlds, there has to be a level of coordination there.
Oh yeah, and the information flow back. The units and the different centers need to have policy direction and guidance, but they also need to, as you said earlier, keep the institution aware. Does the chancellor want to read about something in the news? No.
So let me ask, Adam, you've mentioned agility a few times now. When I hear agility, the term that comes to my mind is policy exceptions. So let me tease on that thread a little bit. So research is still embedded in these institutions, and at least in theory, is still underneath all the same policy umbrellas that the non-research parts of the institution are under. Maybe we can debate that. So can we have a set of policies that covers everything going on in an academic institution, from research to administrative computing to higher ed and learning, or do these need to be separate silos from a policy perspective?
I don't think separate. I think the problem is often you need to get more specific. So the highest level policies are very general and apply to everyone, but then there's additional requirements for special projects and customers, or there's NDAs that you sign and you might have extra requirements along with that. I was actually thinking of agility less with the policy, except when it applies to project initiatives. So a good example would be the University of Illinois has been doing this identity and access management project for several years. And I think there's still quite a few years left. Again, this comes to they have to plan, they have to meet the needs of many more people, and they have to plan way further ahead. I'm running our own at NCSA for our identity management systems. And really, at the end of the day, all it comes down to is I have to get 3 people to agree to something, and then I can make it happen once we have the resources, of course. But that's much different than having to have committees of committees of committees and having to get faculty senate buy-in and all these other things. So that's where the agility comes in, I think.
And I think the trade-off there is running it long-term. So you can get it stood up faster, certainly, but then running that, the grant, the soft money runs out, and you're left with,
Right.
still a need to run that.
But that's why we can't,
And
we
that's
can't
why
take 5 years because the grant's over in 5 years, right?
And that's why you've seen some of the science community identity management projects come and go faster than a single one has done at the system level. Yeah. No questions?
Well, so
There's someone.
I'll be brave enough to get up here.
thank you, Brent.
And thank you very much for doing this panel. It's quite fun. I'm Brent Rainey from NERSC, and I wanted to ask a question. Policy and compliance is about mitigating risk, reducing risk, right? And cybersecurity is a part of it, but very different in a certain way. Do you guys feel empowered to do the right thing when it comes to cybersecurity, or do you feel constrained by compliance and policy that your organization set?
Well, the impression I get from talking to a lot of my peers is they don't feel empowered at all. But I've heard this complaint for years, but I think part of it has to do with the maturation of security. You have a lot of security officers that are still more concerned with their IDS than risk. And I know there's an overlap there, but a lot of folks don't know how to talk in a way that will get them empowered. So I think that goes on a lot. And at the same token, I think part of what makes this a challenge is in many institutions, research and everything else have different governance structures and different hierarchies. And security sort of cuts across that. So it's almost like we ask for a layer of bureaucracy if we try to go up too high, I think.
I would echo that.
So now he's making a face.
No, I'm just thinking my answer to your question would depend on which day and perhaps what time of day you ask it to me. I mean, we all have constraints, but a lot of the challenges around that are idiosyncrasies around our particular institutions and projects and things like that. And I don't know if there's a general answer I can pull out of this.
Well, and I was just talking with someone earlier about this. Authority in higher ed is really bizarre because all that bureaucracy and committees you're talking about, it's kind of it's beneficial at a time, but it's also a kind of giant way to distribute blame when things go wrong. I mean, speaking cynically about it. And, it goes back to your saying about idiosyncratic. Many times I'm amazed at the questions people ask my permission for, but I actually have very little authority to actually grant that what they're asking. But over time, they grow to know, well, you're sort of a bump in the wire, so we have to come talk to you. And it's hard to codify that.
Or sometimes they just know that if they have your buy-in, that's good enough for the security perspective for this other person. But there's no official authority there.
Yeah, exactly.
It's almost a checklist, checking off that, yep, we talked to Mike and
Yeah,
we're good.
and we're
with this.
done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm surprised by things people don't ask too.
So Mike raised, I think, an interesting question with his example on the social justice unit. And so let's say I were to give you a choice between either having a research unit out that's functioning well independently, or to take the cybersecurity resources that unit would be doing, put them into the central cybersecurity office, and bring the responsibility along with that. What are the pros and cons, or would you want to sit somewhere between those two worlds?
I would answer it in two ways. I think philosophically, I'm attracted to the idea of controlling those resources. That may just be me. But the reality is that each of those resources are going to have different funding streams and different decision-making processes. And so by me not controlling them, I actually may increase the number of ways security gets funded. So pragmatically, it's probably better to have them out in the unit and to play nice with them than to try to argue for the resources centrally.
It would be selfish to, have them report directly in. I think that would be the quick answer, but certainly I think that the research area would suffer because of that. I think they would quickly become involved in other projects and other work. So, I think from to that pragmatic point, I think keeping them in the unit, having some direct or dotted line rather, where you at least have a view into what they're doing, I think is important, so you are aware of that, whether that's for planning or future or incident, that you at least are aware of that type of research that's happening in that unit.
So I'm going to be naturally biased because one of those options puts me out of a job. But
That just moves who you're reporting to.
yeah. But in general, I think if it's long-term, stable funding, it might make sense to bring it into central IT. But for these projects that are, overlapping waves of up and down fundings, project specific,
Which
I
is
think
how things really work.
right. I think it makes sense to keep it closer to the resources. To the resources you're protecting.
I think it also supports the notion of sort of accountability. It goes back to that resource stream. If you gave me 6 more people and the option was dedicate 6 people to this problem set, that's a challenge. But if you take the stream of money supporting that kind of research activity and say, you decide how much is the right amount to spend on security, there is a kind of accountability that comes with that, I think.
So you raise a thought in myself, and I don't think any conversation in higher ed is complete until one either re-engineers the tenure system or the federal funding model.
Yeah.
I can't quite figure out how to bring the tenure system into this conversation, so let's focus on the federal funding model. We've talked about the funding streams adding to this and making it challenging. Let's say we could, I always like a magic wand question, right? If we could wave a magic wand over the funding process, is there something that we would change that's related to this that would make this easier or make the answer to this question more clear?
I think it would make it fuzzier. It would make it more attractive to go centrally, but I still think Mike's point's pretty good about having people accountable closer to what they're accountable for. When you put layers between things, the people who accept the risk are very far from it.
I think the balance is the day-to-day versus the proactive, so the reactive versus proactive approach. I think given additional funding, I think that we could certainly throw some folks to deal with the reactive while we were taking on a more proactive approach.
I would love to, anything that forces PIs and that universe, which is phenomenally powerful and autonomous in our environment, to have to at least talk to people like Adam at their institutions, I think would be a good thing.
That's actually beginning to happen.
It's beginning, but I've been hearing that for 10 years, and I want to see it, yeah.
I think we have a question in the audience.
Yep. Ebba here. My question may have been answered already, but English is not my first language, and sometimes doing the translation may be complicated. But considering the way we're going in terms of risk and the way higher eds, meaning universities, are structured, we have so many departments at universities. How are we countering, I guess, threats? Are we moving towards a centralized structure where, I guess you've talked about it, but or how are you guys looking at it? Are you moving your universities into, like the IT, into a more centralized approach, or you still have different schools, different departments doing their own IT, and then I don't even know how it is now. I think the way I may be fuzzy, but I think that we have different departments doing their own thing.
Yeah.
And then the way I see it is that that's a backdoor to something, bad happening.
So if I were to phrase the question here, we have a trend of centralization in IT. Let me assert that for a moment. How do we see that trend affecting the trend for the cybersecurity discussion we've had going forward? Is that a fair summary?
Yes, thank you.
All right.
Well, one thing I think you see at many of the highly distributed large schools is the pressure of professionalization in IT is causing a lot of the distributed IT units to coalesce and become more professional shops unto themselves. So that's a natural pressure. Whether all those bubbles eventually sort of coalesce into a larger one is hard to say, because that distributed culture is really baked in the DNA of the big schools. But in another way, it's easy to say the antidote to over decentralization is a good data breach. Because as soon as the chancellor's in the paper trying to explain things about why this little unit was doing something and the central security office knew nothing about it, something's going to change.
Consolidation happens quickly after that.
Yeah.
The thought that came to my mind, excuse me, was coalescing identity management, for example. It used to be that all of the schools did their own IDM, and now we've consolidated that primarily down to a single login and password across campus. I think we're seeing that in other areas, ran their own Active Directories, and down to some of the specific things, email. I think those services are being coalesced or consolidated, and including some of the security analytics, I think are headed that way too. So I think that's a future trend.
So the things I've seen that go to central IT are things that were once innovative, but now are just road repair.
Commodity.
So, I mean, good example. Wireless doesn't sound very innovative anymore, but once upon a time, individual departments had their own wireless deployments because not every department had wireless. Many didn't. Individual departments had their own email services. They managed all these things separately, and then once enough of them get together and doing it, it gets to a scale where it makes sense to centralize it. For security, I don't know where that makes sense except maybe in the data analytics. And there, I think a better approach is probably data sharing and sharing intelligence and sharing analytical tools. But that has its own barriers too. In some departments, I could certainly see fighting sharing their data.
Okay.
Very much.
We just have 1 minute left. Maybe any of the panelists have a quick closing thought? Okay. If not, I'll ask you to help me thank our panelists. And thank you very much for coming to our session. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did.